And perfect. Let's get started. Okay, so in today's class, we'll talk about one last topic of labor market, which we could not complete in the last class, which was wage discrimination, right? So we'll do that first, and then we'll start off with unit 4, which is about macroeconomics, right? So after this small topic that we have to cover about the labor market, which is wage discrimination. So we'll talk about that because we could not complete it in our last lecture, and then we'll start off with unit 4 of our A2 economics syllabus, which is macroeconomics, wage discrimination. Okay, now if you remember in the last class, I'll give you a little bit of an overview. What were the things we discussed? So we talked about that there, apart from demand supply, there are other factors that affect wages, right? And within that, we talked about, right, what are other factors that affect wages, especially in imperfect markets. There are a couple of factors that affect wages. Other factors that affect wages. In a perfect labor market, we know that it's only the demand supply of labor, right, that affect wages, right? But in imperfect labor markets, there are a lot of other factors that affect wages, right? So right now I'm talking about imperfect markets here, right? Because perfect markets are simple and easy. Demand for labor, supply of labor. More the demand, higher the wages. More the supply, lower the wages, right? Perfect market. Imperfect labor markets have other factors as well, which included what? So we're doing a quick recap over here. So presence of trade unions. Think about it. So if there are trade unions present, then obviously they can negotiate higher wages for their workers. How that works, we already know. They take industrial action, they negotiate for higher wages and things like that, right? So that's one factor that affect wages. Then another factor apart from demand and supply that affect wages include government intervention. So why would government intervene? Government intervenes to achieve more equitable distribution, to achieve more equitable outcome for the labor market, and in the process, they implement some policies and rules which affect wages, right? So like minimum wages affect, help the poor people and so on. But on the other hand, it can also cause some unemployment. We talked about that, right? So it might be good in some cases, but not always good in other cases, right? Okay, now that's the second factor that affect wages. Then we talked about monopsony. What is monopsony? Monopsony is a market where there's a single employer. We did discuss this in detail, that how do monopsony markets operate, why they pay lower wages compared to their workers, compared to other markets, because these are, monopsony is a single employer. Monopsony is a single employer, so monopsony can afford to exploit its consumer. Just like monopoly is a single producer for a product, monopsony is a single employer for a market, and therefore they can exploit their workers, right? And then apart from that, we also talked about wage elasticity of labor demand and wage elasticity of labor supply, right? Now we discussed these in detail, that what wage elasticity of labor demand is, right? And then we also looked at it through graph and the formula, right? So very simply speaking, wage elasticity of labor demand calculates how much will be the change in labor demand due to change in wages of labor. So if there is more change in demand for labor due to change in wage, that's known as more elastic, right? And if there is less change in demand due to change in wages, that is less elastic. Now, what type of occupations will have more elastic demand? What type of occupations will have more elastic demand? Preet, do you remember? What type of quantity demanded of labor, right? So let's write this down as QDL. So occupations which are easier to be replaced with, occupations that are easier to be replaced with technology or machines, they will have more elastic supply. Those occupations will have more elastic supply, right? Why so? I'll tell you, right? Think about it. So if these are the two demand curves, let's say demand curve A for any occupation and demand curve B for another occupation. Now think about this. Just by looking at the graph, we know whichever of the graphs is steeper, whichever of the two is steeper, that is less elastic, right? This is something that we studied in AS as well, right? So we do know that this is less elastic and the other one is more elastic because that is flatter. Okay. Apart from that, what occupations would these represent? Now think about this. If it's easier to replace a worker with technology or machines. That's more elastic demand. Why? Because think about this. If wages are going up, if wages are going up, how would firm respond to that? Firm would respond to that by cutting on the demand for labor. If wages go up for any occupation, it's not just for any one occupation. Whenever wages will go up, firms would want to cut labor demand. Why? Because it's expensive for them to hire labor now. But in some cases, it's not that easy to replace labor with something else. When would you be able to cut labor? When you can replace labor with something else. When you cannot, you have to bear the expenses, right? So we did talk about this, that if, let me choose this color, right? So if it's less elastic, right? So let's say for doctors, I mean, even though a lot of technology has, a lot of technology has progressed a lot, but still it's not very easy to replace doctors with robots or things like that. It's still in the process, but not that much. But if you think of an occupation like receptionist, right? I mean, pretty much you can replace this type of work with technology and machines and computers and whatnot, right? So are you getting me? So these are some of the things that you have to be mindful of, that if it's easier to replace an occupation with technology like a receptionist, right, it will have more elastic supply, because whenever wages go up, right, so there will be more decrease. There will be more decrease in the demand for receptionists, because obviously technology is not that cheap. You can buy a digital screen and put it on the front desk rather than having a person sitting and telling people where to go. Yes or no? And yeah, and for occupations which are difficult to replace with technology, like a doctor, right, you can't help it, right? You, even if wages are going up, you need doctors in the hospital to take care of the patients, right? So that was wage elasticity of demand. Then another factor that we talked about it that affect wages was wage elasticity of labor supply. So we'll quickly discuss this one more time, and then we'll move on to wage discrimination, wage elasticity of labor supply. Now think about this. Similarly, just like elasticity of demand was looking at how much will be the change in demand for labor due to change in wages, wage elasticity of labor supply calculates how much change will be in the supply of labor due to change in wages. Due to change in wages. So let's do it like this, right? So you have wages on the y-axis and you have quantity supplied on the x-axis, right? Your wages on the y-axis and you have quantity supplied of labor on the x-axis. Okay. Now I'll make two uh, supply curves, one like this and one like this. So again, we know that whichever of the two is steeper, that's less elastic. Whichever of the two is steeper, that's less elastic, right? So this one, D1, is less elastic because it's steeper compared to D2, which is, flatter. So this one is more elastic. D2 is flatter, that's more elastic. D1 is steeper, that's less elastic. Okay, now this being said, think about this. Now, which occupations have more elastic supply and which occupations have less elastic supply? That's the main question, right? Nothing about it. Whenever wages in an occupation go up, how would labor respond to that? If wages are going up in any occupation, how does the labor respond to that? Obviously, people would want to join that occupation because now that becomes more lucrative, that becomes more financially promising, more financially rewarding, right? But there's another thing to that. Think about this. So if I have to compare that, whether there will be more influx of doctors or will there be more influx of receptionists, right? Or will there be more influx of receptionists, right? When wages increase. Now think about this. So if let's say you have 10% increase in the wages for doctors, right? If there's 10% increase in the wages for doctor and there's 10% increase in the wages for receptionist. Now we already know that becoming a doctor is more difficult task. It requires more years of training. It requires you to do some, practice, specialize, and then so on and so forth, right? It's quite difficult compared to becoming a receptionist, right? So when the wages of the two occupations is increasing by the same amount, when wages of the two occupations is increasing by the same percentage, sorry, not the amount, same percentage, you will see a greater influx in the supply of receptionists because becoming receptionist is an easier thing compared to becoming a doctor. Got it? Students, are you getting me? Is everything clear? Right? Okay. Now, that was another factor that affects wages. Now, then the last factor that we'll talk about now, just give me a second. I'll be back real quick. Just give me a second, breathe. Right? I just need to. Okay, are we good on this? Breathe. Okay, now we are discussing other factors that affect wages, right? Obviously, apart from demand supply. Now, the last of these factors that we will talk about today, which we didn't get the chance to discuss in the last class, is wage discrimination, right? Now, this is not something which is new to us. In fact, recently we have seen, a lot of hype about this word, rightly so, because in a lot of major industries across the globe, in major companies across the globe, we have seen that companies discriminate in terms of wages when it comes to paying different type of people. So for the same type of work, for the same type of hard work, a male actor might be paid more in Hollywood, Bollywood, we know that, right? Similarly in Pakistan as well, compared to a female actress, right? And obviously that is what wage discrimination is. So we're simply putting this forward, and it's not just the entertainment industry, it's other industries as well, normal banks, schools, hospitals, could be, right? Okay, now what's wage discrimination? So wage discrimination is when two employees who have the same skill set, right? That's very important that we understand this definition correctly. When two employees with the same skill set, right? Same qualification, same experience, right? So within skill set, I'm listing all the things in case you want it to be more specific, like education, experience, qualification, right? Things that usually affect wages, right? And with the same even designation, qualification, right? And even with the same designation and same designation, like what position someone is working on within an organization, that's what the designation or position is, right? Same designation, earning different amounts based on their gender, race, religion, ethnicity, earning different amounts. Just give me a second, I'll read your comment. Different amounts due to their gender, race, ethnicity, religion, whatever. Could be other things as well, right? But these are the ones that I can think of, the major ones. Okay, we're good on this. Okay, now students, let's see, you have a comment here. Right, okay. Yeah, okay, sure. I'll quickly type that over there. Don't worry about it. Okay, now, what is wage discrimination? Wage discrimination is very simple, right? So we do know that there is price discrimination. So think about this. If A Pakistani goes to some place in Pakistan and the hotel is charging him 10,000 rupees for a night. On the other hand, when a foreigner goes to that same hotel at the same time of the year and that person has to, like, that person is quoted, let's say 12,000 or 15,000 rupees for the same room, for the same hotel, and for the same time of the year. Now that is price discrimination. You're charging different prices for the same product, for the same service to two different people based on the idea that one is a foreigner. He or she might not know what the prices are in Pakistan, or perhaps assuming that they have higher affordability to pay. Right? This is what price discrimination is. Now, similarly, it's wage discrimination. So when two people are equally qualified, they have the same designation, right? Even then you pay someone, you are paying someone more than the other one. Why? Because that person, if let's say is a male, and you think that, you can afford to pay females less, or you can afford to pay black people, people of color, as we say, we can afford to pay people of color less in USA compared to white people. I mean, that's complete discrimination. That's what it is, right? Okay, so I'll quickly add this on the I'll quickly add this on the notes as well, right? Now this all brings us to the end of wage market, right? Now today we are starting off with the new topic, which is about macroeconomics. That's very interesting. So we will jump onto that in a bit. Okay. Wage labor market. Here it is. I also need to organize these notes. Okay. Just a second. Okay. Now, if you remember, okay, here at the end we had the idea of wage, right? Now, what is wage discrimination? I've just mentioned that basically when two employees set experience, qualification, education, so do the gender, race, city. You got on this, students? So that's what wage discrimination is, right? And this is unfair. Sometimes, a manager knows one of the two employees and doesn't know the other one. So he or she is trying to give a favor to the person that he or she knows, but at the end of the day, why would you pay someone less than, or why would you pay someone more than the other person if they're doing the same task, they are equally capable of, they're taking the same responsibility in your organization and so on. And this is totally unfair, right? Okay, and the governments are obviously making rules around that. So hopefully this will be taken care of. So let's continue, students, and let's start off with this new topic, which is macroeconomics. Now think about this. Let me give you an overview, brief, that what are the topics that we'll cover in this unit. Now in macroeconomics, A2 economics, the macroeconomic unit in A2 economics covers a lot of different things, right? First one is, so the first one we'll talk about is the GDP part, right? So we'll talk about the GDP part. We'll look at, how GDP is determined. So how GDP is determined, how macroeconomic operates overall, right? So we'll look at the big, obviously, macroeconomics is about the bigger picture, looking at the entire economy as a whole, right? So in this unit 4, first few topics are about how GDP is determined and all that stuff. In that, there are some model, and there's one model that we have to discuss and so on, right? After that, we'll talk about how the banking system operates, right? We'll talk about the banks, which is a very interesting topic, how banks operate, the money supply, interest rate, and all that stuff, right? And then we'll talk about unemployment, what factors cause unemployment. That's a fairly simple and shorter topic, and all these things, right? So today it's our first day. We're starting off with this, and then we'll move forward. Okay, now students, let's get started. Macroeconomics. Okay, Now, the first thing that we'll talk about is central profit. Now, I told you that the first thing that we'll discuss is how GDP is determined, right? How GDP, can you see my screen? Let me increase this size of this. Okay, how is GDP determined? Now, in AS economics, we talked about a very simple model, which was about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, right? Now, what is GDP? If in case we need a quick refresher, we can do that. So GDP is basically total value of goods and services produced in an economy during certain time period. Total value of all goods and services produced in an economy during certain time period is known as GDP. Now, if you remember, I'm just giving you a recap of what you should know from your AS. So we used to have general price level, which is not the price of one product, it is the aggregate price of all the goods and services produced in that country. So in microeconomics, when we look at one market, right? In microeconomics, when we look at one market, like fruits, vegetables, cars, phones, clothes, right? So we have price of the product on the y-axis and we have quantity demanded of that thing on the x-axis, right? So price and quantity demanded, right? And obviously there's inverse relationship, we know that. But now it's not microeconomics that we're talking about. It's not microeconomics that we're talking about. We're talking about the entire economy, the entire country. So when we want to look at the average or the general price level, that is the thing that we write on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis, we have GDP. I just explained you GDP is gross domestic product and it is the total value of all goods and services produced in an economy during certain time period. Now, to determine GDP in AS, we learned that downward sloping is your aggregate demand, right? And upward sloping is your aggregate supply. Downward sloping is the country's total demand or aggregate supply, aggregate demand as we know. And upward sloping is aggregate supply, which is the total supply or total production in an economy. Now, just like in normal market where the demand and supply intersects, that's an equilibrium. Similarly, in macroeconomics, where the aggregate demand intersects with aggregate supply, that will be where the aggregate demand intersects with aggregate supply, that will be the equilibrium in macroeconomics. So on the y-axis, you will have GPL, right? GPL1, general price level. So at this equilibrium point, this much will be the average price level in the economy, average prices, right? And this much will be your real GDP, right? In fact, I forgot to add the word real here because real GDP, it's real GDP, right? I'll talk more about it. How is it real or nominal, right? You don't need to worry about it. Okay. Now, based on what is this graph showing us? This graph is showing us the equilibrium in macroeconomics. So if this is for Pakistan, this is for India, this is for China, whatever country you want to think about. So based on what is the total demand for all goods and services in that country, aggregate demand, and based on what's the total production or total supply of goods and services in that economy, an equilibrium will be reached, which is this point, which shows you two values, which shows you the average prices, which shows you the average price level, and it shows you the total GDP that will be produced in that country during that point in time. Easy? Are we good on this? So that is how we used to, that is what we know from our AS. But now in A2, we'll look at it from a more systematic way. We'll look at it from a more systematic way, right? So the model that we'll study in A2 economics, which is part of our syllabus, is known as Keynesian Cross, right? So what is Keynesian Cross? How it looks like? What's the purpose of it? I can tell you the purpose, but the other things we'll talk about it later on. Okay. Now, Keynesian Cross is a model, right? Just like we talked about equilibrium model, utility maximization model, do you remember in unit 2? Just like we talked about producer equilibrium, that was a kind of a model where we looked at graphs and we see that, you know, what's the purpose, how do producers minimize their cost of production and things like that, right? And all that stuff. So just like those concepts, Keynesian Cross is also a model in which what we are trying to do is a model used to predict a country's GDP, right? So that is predict a country's GDP. Right. Now, how much will be the country's total value of goods and services? That is what this Keynesian cross helps us with, right? So during, let's say, we can also use it for future projections. So in the coming year, how much will be India's GDP or how much will be Pakistan's GDP, right? We can use Keynesian cross. Economists do use this model to predict, right? We got on this? Any confusion so far? Anything that's not clear? Okay, that's very simple. No worries, no worries. I'll add it over down, right? So all of this is graphical work. It's just one line. It's a model used to predict a country's GDP, right? Right? So I'll write it down after this. But let's first look at the graph. Now, to know how the Keynesian cross looks like, to know, to study Keynesian cross, we have to do something else before that. And that thing is circular flow of income. So um, before we can jump to Keynesian cross, we need to know what circular flow of income is, because that will show you something very important. And I'm coming to this right away. So circular flow of income is a graph that shows how money circulates in an economy during, how money circulates in an economy generally, right? Okay, let me write this down. So what is circular flow of income? Shows in an economy, right? Now, think about this. In an economy, there are different groups. Economy is obviously the whole country. So we can't look at that. If let's say Qasim is a resident of Pakistan, uh, where did where did Qasim get the money from, and then whom did Qasim give the money from? So obviously, it will not be that much detailed. It will not look at individuals in a country, but what circular flow will tell us, which we'll see in a bit, that we divide different people in different categories. So if you think of me, I am a consumer, right? Obviously, I do work somewhere, but I am mainly on the consumer side, that I live in a home, I go and buy products, I do groceries, buy stuff and stuff. Then there are other businesses in Pakistan who are the suppliers, who are the firms who produce goods and services. Like Mega Lecture is a supplier, Mega Lecture is a firm, right? Which provides online teaching and so on, right? Then there is the role of the government. What is the role of the government? We know already by now, being economics student, that government is there to make sure that everything is running smooth in the economy. They charge taxes, they provide subsidies, they regulate the markets. And then there is another sector in the economy, which is international trade, right? Four sectors of an economy that shows money circulates in an economy. Sectors. This being said, let's name the sectors. There are four sectors of an economy. Sectors meaning the groups. So the first one, as I said, are the households. So my example is of the household. I belong to a household, right, where I go to shop, consumer basically. You can think of those as consumers. Then you have firms, the companies, like Mega Lecture is a firm, is a company that provides goods and services, right? Right? Then you have the government. We already know what the government is, and then there is another fourth and the last sector of the economy, which is known as international trade. So these are the four sectors of an economy. Okay. Now, this being said, what we'll do is we'll move to the graph and we'll look at how the circular flow of income looks like, because only then you'll be able to understand what this shows us, right? So I'll use the next slide because we need more space. So I will write it down in a smaller font. Circular flow of income. Okay, now this is true. Now this graph that I'm about to make will be the same for every country in the world, obviously, because we're just looking at how the money is moving between different sectors, and every country in the world can be divided in the four sectors that I just listed: households, firms, government, and international trade. Okay, now think about this. Students, let's first start off. What we'll do is, first of all, we'll list the two most important sectors. What are the two most important sectors in an economy, right? So households and firms, right? Just give me a second. Two most important, and why these two are the most important ones, I'll explain you in a bit, right? The two most important sectors in an economy are firms, which produce goods and services, and obviously the households that buy those goods and services. Any confusion so far, right? So these are the two most important sectors. Now, Think about this. You have to look at this in a very logical manner. Households, like I as an individual work with mega lecture. I as an individual, as an employee, work with any company. And this is not only me, there's so many other people, hundreds and millions and thousands of people in Pakistan who work in different companies, right? So if you think about this, firms are providing the factors of production, sorry, households are providing firms the factors of production that they need to produce goods and services. Do you agree with me? So what are FOPs? We know factors of production are land, labor, capital, and enterprise, right? So some of us will be entrepreneurs, some of us will be employees, some of us will be managers, some of us will be landowners who are using their land, right? Renting out their land. And some of us will be capital owners who are renting out their capital and so on, right? So from households, resources flow to the firms. Now, what do firms do for those resources? Breathe. What's what's the nature of what's the nature of job of firms? So using these resources, what will the firm do? The firm will convert these resources, factors of production, into goods and services. Yes or no? So firms use these resources to produce goods and services, right? That's why goods and services are flowing from firms to households. Easy, good, okay. So first circle is showing you that households transfer resources to firms, and then firms use those resources to produce goods and services and transfer these to households. Okay, fair enough. Then comes in another thing. Think about this. These resources obviously are not free. So these resources are not free. So if I work for Mega Lecture, do I not earn anything? Obviously I do earn, right? So I earn what? I earn wages. So as a manager, as a worker, right? Then if I would have been the landowner, I would have earned rent. If I would have been capital owner, I would have earned interest. And obviously, if I'm an entrepreneur, I would have earned profit, right? So the compensation to factors of production is coming from firms to household. The compensation of factors of production is coming from firms to household, like this. Easy? We good on this? Okay. But again, think about this. Whatever products these households are buying, they're also not free, right? So households also have to pay the firms the expenditure on goods and services. Obviously, you have to buy. So whenever I go to shop, products are not free for me or anyone in this country or in any country for that matter, right? So you expenditure on goods, right? Goods and services. So you are spending some amount. Households are paying the amount to buy the goods and services. So that's the bigger flow. That's the that's how the circular flow of income shows how money is flowing. But we haven't completed it yet. Why? Because we haven't shown that what's the role of the other two sectors. We haven't shown what's the role of the other two sectors, which includes what? Government and international trade. Okay. Now here we'll take a minute and think about it, that what effect government has on the circular flow, like the way money is moving in a country, right? And similarly, we'll also think about that what role international trade has on the flow of money in an economy, right? Now, this is very important to discuss. Think about this. Now, if you think of government, we know that the main purpose, like how the government is affecting the flow of income, is through taxes and government spending, right? So it's through taxes and government spending, right? Yes or no? So government take taxes and government spending, right? And government then spends that money on different projects like building a school, building a hospital, building a motorway, highway, blah, 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 right? Similarly, what's the role of international trade? So when Pakistan engages in international trade, right, either it will be exporting any products. So what are exports? You produce a product in your country and you sell it to foreign consumers in other countries. That's exports. Imports is the opposite. Obviously, you are importing goods, right? So products are produced in other foreign countries, but local consumers like Pakistanis are buying that, right? Those are imports. Now think about this. Some of these are injections and some of these are withdrawals, right? Injections and withdrawals. So this is another term that you need to understand. What is an injection? So injection means injection of income, right? Injection of income or injection of money in an economy, right? Injection and withdrawal. Withdrawal is the opposite, that the money is going out of the system. When money comes in the system, it's known as injection. When money goes out of the system, that's known as withdrawal or leakage. So these are the two words that we use in economics, right? So withdrawal or leakage. Now, when money is coming in, that's an injection. Now, which of these will be the injections? Think about this. When the government spends money in a country, whether that be on building a school, whether that be on building a hospital, whether that be on constructing a new highway, that's government spending, right? We good? Okay. Now that is an injection because that's putting money into the system. So government spending is definitely an injection. What about taxes? We do know that taxes is taking money out of the system, because when the government takes taxes, whatever income I have earned, some of that goes to the government. Similarly, what other people earn in Pakistan, some chunk of that goes to government. So that's a leakage, that's a withdrawal. Then exports, think about it. When you export something, the product is going out of Pakistan, but the money is coming in. When I export a product, when a Pakistani company exports something, that could be anything, right, to consumers in other parts of the world, they pay us the compensation, they pay us the money for that, for the products that we are exporting. So exports are injections for the country. On the other hand, imports are leakages, because when we import something, right, we pay the cash, we pay the money, we pay the, and that is money flowing out of the system, right? So far we have listed two injections, and so far we have listed two withdrawals. Then there are two more. Think about this. What happens when an individual invests in an economy? Think about it. So let's say I have some savings and I decided to start a business. Now this money is coming into the system, right? I will hire some people, I will, rent out some premises and things like that, right? So I'm putting money into the system. That's injection. Definitely that's an injection, right? On the other hand, when I save money, whatever income I earn and I save some of that, that is a leakage. That's a withdrawal from the system. Why? Because that's money going out of the system, right? That's not being used at the moment, and therefore it's a leakage. We good on this? Okay. Now coming back, we will add these three leakages and these three injections on this graph. So there's no proper way of doing that. So let's say you can add all the injections over here. So you have investment, which I just explained what investment is. That is, the arrow is towards the graph. Why? Because the money is coming into the system, right? Then you have exports, right? So that's also an injection in an economy, right? So you have exports, and then you have government spending. So these are the three injections into the system, and the three leakages from the system that we just discussed. Government spending, right? The three leakages from the system which we just discussed, I'll show you again, are taxes. That's when the government takes money away from the people. Savings, when I decide to save some of my income and not use it at the moment. And the third and the last one is imports, right? So this being said, that brings us towards completion of this diagram, which is known as circular flow of income, right? Preet, is everything clear? Is there any confusion, anything that's not clear, anything you want to ask me? And as I said, why was this important? This is important, obviously. First of all, it's part of our syllabus. And secondly, this is helping us to build on the next model that we're moving towards, which is Keynesian Cross, right? Okay, perfect. Now, what is Keynesian Cross? Let's go back to our notes and write that down. So Keynesian Cross is a model. Country. Now, this being said, we are moving towards that. Okay, yeah, we can stop here for today. But yeah, okay, so we can stop here for today. There will be no class tomorrow, Preet, but we can have a double class in the coming week, right? We can decide on a day someday in the coming week, right? Good. Okay, so I'll see you.